Hi there, this is Ronnie coming at you with a video. Well, can hardly avoid the news at the moment. And I'm not going to go into the realities of what's going on at the moment. I hope everyone is staying safe and doing the best they can. But I thought I'd make a video looking at the scenario of a pandemic from a role-playing point of view. Using one in your game. How would you go about it? What sort of tone would you use? And from whose perspective would you make it from? And would that influence your tone? Couple of examples from fiction. I'm going to use the current situation. Couple of examples from fiction. One that comes to mind is Stephen King's The Stand, which has this apocalyptic sort of superflu called Captain Trips, which wipes out just insane amounts of the population, and then what's left sort of gets divided into sort of good and evil. I have not read the book. I saw the 1990s miniseries. I have it on DVD somewhere. So there's that. The other thing, also from the 90s, is a film, a sort of action thriller film thing called Outbreak, which was directed by Wolfgang Petersen and has a hell of a cast, actually, with Dustin Hoffman and Rene Russo and Donald Sutherland, Morgan Freeman, Cuba Gooding Jr., Kevin Spacey. And it gets a bit silly near the end, it has to be said, but for the most part it's a fairly intense thriller about a sort of disease control team headed up by sort of military, headed up by Dustin Hoffman, who are trying to find a cure for a particular infection that's infecting a small town in America, and dealing with a sort of a conspiracy of silence with some of his sort of higher up, because it had been used as a biological weapon. And it's an interesting film, but it says to me that there's two ways, or sort of 2 points of view, I guess you can take. There's the people fighting the disease, looking for a cure, and your player characters being sort of medical professionals, members of the military, the team who are sort of authorized and sort of put in there to identify what strain, come up with a cure, and trying to manage the pandemic so it doesn't get out of hand. And then there's the view from the street, the everyday person living with the possibility of catching a disease that may very well be fatal, because you could sort of take a little bit out of current events or recent events and so on, and have the idea of a disease that has a bit of a longer gestation period, incubation period, so that people could be carrying it and not realizing it, because it takes a couple of weeks for the symptoms to show. And then you've got that problem of well, the symptoms have shown, But who have you been in contact with in the how many days or weeks before? But as a person on the ground, it means that every interaction you have could be with someone who might be carrying, even if they don't know it. So then it comes down to what sort of tone do you have? Do you have it as a sort of, I guess, a horror? And horror to me doesn't necessarily mean sort of ghouls and ghosts and supernatural and, you know, people in masks going on killing sprees. Horror in its absolute sense is that feeling of utter helplessness, that you are powerless against something that is completely oblivious to your fear. It's just going to kill you anyway. And that sort of build of paranoia, and I know a lot of thrillers are sort of paranoia, sort of thrillers of sort of 60s and 70s. Wouldn't be called horrors, but to me, if you're walking around in perpetual terror because you're worried that every step you take could be your last, that's horror. That really is. That's the absolute sense of helplessness is horror. And you could easily have player characters who are just everyday people, possibly caught in a town that's been cordoned off for quarantine, and having to deal with the possibility that at any moment they might catch us. And how do they deal with that? Do they lock themselves away? Do they start to go mad? I mean, do you sort of put cabin fever into the mix? You know, the idea of people just shut up and shut off from everyone, unable to leave, only having a limited space, going crazy because they've only got a limited space and just going crazy. That's a real possibility. Or would you use something that is a bit more proactive so that the players feel that they are fighting this monster? And that would mean putting them in as actual sort of medical professionals, CDC and so on, and actually making them proactive. And I think either set is okay. The only thing I would say is, and this is something I've had with one of my daughter's friends, has Pandemic Legacy, this board game, where as you play through the scenarios, the board game changes. Things can change and augment and so on. And I've always been resistant to the idea of ever owning such a game. I'm still resistant. And my reason is simple. If I want a one-off game that's got replay value, I can play Pandemic. In fact, I've got 3 different versions of Pandemic. I've got regular Pandemic, I've got Pandemic Cthulhu, and I've got the recent one, Rapid Response. But they're kind of one-off things. And if I was going to do a game about trying to beat a disease as a one-shot game, I wouldn't use an RPG. I'd just get one of them out, one of those board games out, and we'd play that. But if I want to do a game that's going to be over multiple sessions and is going to deal with possibly globally, then I I wouldn't want to play that as a board game. I would want to play that as an RPG. So what RPG would you use? Well, quite frankly, any RPG can work at this point. Any genre can work at this point. Because it really, the idea is universal. You could set it in medieval times during the Black Plague. You can, you could have set it during the time of the Spanish flu. You can fantasy some disease. Maybe it has a mystical component to it, and it's ravaging through the countryside. Sci-fi. Maybe there's nanotech involved. It's the idea of either being a person on the ground or the person actually trying to deal with the problem and find a cure and find a solution. Either way, they're not restricted in any way by genre, because disease happens everywhere. It's not restricted to here and now or this plane of existence. So it's going to happen in any genre, and you can use that. But it really comes down to how you would want to play it. Me personally, I would go with this. My personal opinion, how I would run it, is the guy on the ground. I would run it as a horror. And not anything supernatural. I really wouldn't be interested in that. It would be about paranoia. It would be about people losing their minds. Have everyone being quarantined in a small town and watch that town tear itself apart through cabin fever. And watch what happens when, as the quarantine goes on and supplies start to lessen. And then you'll get some nutter will try and break the barrier and get out. Because they'll be so... they'll just be so sort of wide-eyed. Sort of stir crazy to an extreme amount. So I would run it as a horror. You can. I'd be tempted to run it as a sort of CDC thing. Basically, Pandemic the RPG. But my instinct as a GM would be to run it as sort of dark horror. In terms of system, again, instinct would be to use Cult, simply because it's just a phenomenal modern horror game. Albeit the issue I have is from the 90s, but even then. True 20 would work. Even Savage Worlds, although I wouldn't use Savage Worlds for the street on the ground. The sort of street level horror thing. Because I don't think... as much as I love Savage Worlds, it does have a weak spot there. I don't think it works well for psychological horror. True 20 with the sanity system from the horror, if you get the revised edition of the rulebook, or the True 20 companion, which has got the features, but the sanity mechanic there, and just the general lethality of that system, I think works better. Any really modern day, in fact, any system, to be honest, will work. I would tend to make it modern day, simply because it works for me. But you could do that sort of setup for any sort of any genre. So those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back soon with another video.